Today we're going to end chapter 6. We've been looking at chapter 6, the context of reclaim. And in chapter 6, really what we've been looking at is, again, Jesus called to discipleship, teaching us how to prioritize our lives. And in the call of discipleship, Jesus lists a list of priorities and how we should prioritize our relationships. And in doing that, really what Jesus is teaching us is how to relearn life. How to relearn life. And I'm hoping that we understand when we talk about these hierarchy of relationships, and I'm hoping that we understand when we obey the gospel and become Christians, in essence, what we are really doing, or what we are really tasked to do with our lives, is we're learning how to relearn how to live life. And that is a process that doesn't stop. From the time that we obey the gospel of Christ to the time that we leave this world, what we are engaged in is a process of actually learning how to relive or relearning how to live life. And that's what Jesus came to teach mankind. Now, we have been looking at these hierarchy relationships, and we left off at the relationship with our spouse, and we began to talk about understanding the hierarchy relationship for those who are unmarried and are single. And we have been looking at this idea of the true meaning of what it means to be single. And so we looked at, we wanted to give account and consideration to those who are in our class, who are in the process of living out their faith, unmarried. Those who are unmarried, and then they're tasked with having to live out their faith. And we have titled that, we have come to consider people who are unmarried as being single. But what we learned is singleness is not necessarily defined by the fact that you are unmarried. But singleness is a whole different meaning. And so that's what we have been discussing our last few classes. And walking into the room, actually, is Courtney. Courtney, good to see her, the second oldest daughter. She, let's give a love deposit for being live and in person. She shared with us in one of our classes as we begin to explore and give consideration to those who are unmarried, living out their faith as quote unquote a single person. And again, we begin, as we begin to talk about being single, what does it really actually mean to be single? And it's important that we get a proper understanding, proper definition of what the Bible actually talks about being single. And so in this, and we developed a theme that had to do with God's strategy for the season of singleness. God's strategy for the season of singleness. That is a season that every person actually goes through. When you go back and look at Scripture, there's a season that all of us go through, should go through, to become single. And in becoming single, we are actually ready to engage in all other relationships. So this morning, what we want to do is to put a bow on this subject of God's season of singleness. And so we want to do this morning is look at some of the just big takeaways from our discussions that we've had over the past several classes on this idea of being single. So we want to conclude this morning and culminate by looking at the big takeaways of what it really means to be single. Okay, and so as we go through this list of takeaways, we'll stop and we'll engage and go in depth with some of the takeaways that we want to make sure that we get clarity on. So, one of the big takeaways from our discussion relating to singleness is your marriage or relationships, and we also discussed that singleness is not relegated to just a marriage relationship. Singleness relates to all relationships, all contexts of relationships that we might be in. So your marriage or your relationships are only as good as your singleness. That's takeaway number one. Your marriage or any other relationship is only as good as your singleness. We also learned, one of the takeaways is that the most important relationship is your intrapersonal relationship, meaning getting along with yourself, and not your interpersonal relationship, meaning getting along with others. The most important relationship is your intrapersonal relationship, the relationship that you have with yourself. And God is the primary, most important relationship when it comes to being single. And not your interpersonal relationships. And your relationship with others are not as important, is not the most important relationship. And then the other takeaway is you can't have an interpersonal relationship until you settle the intrapersonal relationship. It's impossible to have quality interpersonal relationships until you have first settled your intrapersonal relationship. And we began talking about that in more detail when we look at the value for the month, the value of New Self-Love and what it communicates. It communicates this very idea, this very thought, this very principle. Let's look at it. New Self-Love. Let's read it together. The love and intimacy in my single most important relationship with God, which is the main thing in my life, which allows me to experience love and intimacy in every significant relationship in my life, which is how I keep the main thing. Now notice, again, anybody who's been in ministry for any period of time have used this term, my single most important relationship with God. We use that all the time. And the question, though, is, what degree of understanding do we understand when we say my single most important relationship with God? And when we look at the Bible, when we look at Mark chapter 12, there's some insight here that helps us to actually quantify what it really means to be single. According to Mark chapter 12, we're not going to go over there now because we've gone over there in previous classes. But I want us to make sure that we don't miss this. The relationship that we have with God and ourselves are critical to the relationships that we're going to have with anybody else. And I know we heard that. But what we miss in that is we stop sometimes short of really assessing the degree in which I have a relationship with my own self. If we were to stop to really measure how well do I get along with me? How well do I get along with myself? And for most people, if you really stop and really begin to just kind of analyze that question, and we're gonna do that here in a little bit. We're gonna actually just give you some ways of how you can measure and quantify how well you get along with yourself. And what most people will find is that we really don't get along well with ourselves. And it's in that, not getting along well with yourself, that's the personal relationship that you have with yourself. That's what it really means not to be single. One is really not single until one gets to a place to where you have come to really get along with yourself. Actually get to a point to where you really love yourself. And so, that being said, here are some things in terms of what it really means. This is how you know whether or not you can really get along with yourself. You know whether or not you get along with yourself if you know when you get to a point to where you know who you are. You get to a point where when you know you're not getting along with yourself, when you don't know who you are, when you don't appreciate who you are, when you fail to love who you are, when you cannot love, value, and appreciate other people, that's an indice of you knowing that you don't really get along with yourself. And the most important pursuit then that all of us have in life is the pursuit of self-discovery. The most important pursuit that any of us can undertake is the pursuit of self-discovery. Because it's in that pursuit when you're able to know who you are, you're able to appreciate who you are, you are able to understand who you are, you are able to love who you are. And it's from that basis that you're able to actually value and appreciate others. Look in your Bible in Genesis chapter 3, verse 6, real quick. This is why it's important for all of us to get to a place to where we have a pursuit of self-discovery. And it's an ongoing pursuit as well. Self-discovery. Genesis chapter 3, verse number 6.
And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food,
and when the woman saw that the tree was good for food,
and that it was pleasant to the eyes,
and it was pleasant to the eyes, read,
and a tree to be desired to make one wise,
and a tree to be desired to make one wise,
she took of the fruit thereof.
what did she do?
She took of the fruit thereof,
She took of the fruit thereof,
and did
and
eat, and gave also to her husband.
And then, okay, back up again, Genesis 3, verse 6.
And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food,
Go to verse 5.
for God doth know
Okay.
that in the day ye eat thereof,
For God does know, Satan came to the woman and said, for God does know, read,
that the day ye eat thereof,
that the day you eat thereof,
your eyes shall be opened,
that your eyes will be open,
and ye shall be as God.
and you shall be as God. And as a result of this statement, what happened in verse 6?
And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food,
And so when then the woman saw that the tree was good for food,
and it was pleasant to the eyes,
and that it was pleasant to the
and
eyes,
a tree to be desired to make one wise,
and a tree that desired to make one wise,
she took of the fruit thereof,
she took of the fruit thereof,
and did eat,
and did
and
eat,
gave also to her husband with her,
and then also gave to her husband that was with her.
and
Question.
he did eat.
And he did eat. Question. What caused the woman to fall into disobedience? The snake. All right. The snake made it. You know what? I'm glad you said that, Sister Tommy. I'm glad you said that. I grew up at a time where one of the popular TV shows of the day that I grew up was Flip Wilson. Flip Wilson used to be for those I'm looking at the generations in there. How many of us know who Flip Wilson is? Okay, there's some. Flip Wilson was a black comedian, and he was on TV, and he had this dual character that he would play. Okay, he had Geraldine, and Geraldine was a character in herself. And whenever Geraldine ended up doing something that she shouldn't do, her comment would be, "The devil made me do it." Okay. I shouldn't have done it. The devil made me do it. But you know, the interesting thing about that is how many of us who are Christians live our lives even today. And when things happen in our lives to us, and our default mechanism is, we're just like Geraldine. We blame everything circumstantially that happened to us on that snake. Did the snake make her do that? No. What caused this woman to fall in disobedience?
It was her own choice.
It was her choice. But what triggered, what motivated and inspired the choice that she made?
She saw.
The lust of the eye. What caused her to see what motivated the way that her perception in terms of how she saw things from her eye? Huh?
Thought she could be wise.
Okay, notice the seed that was planted in verse 5. Read verse 5.
For God doth know.
For God does know
that in the day ye eat
that in the day that you eat thereof,
then your eyes shall be opened.
Then your eyes will be open.
And ye shall be as God.
And then, with your eyes being open, you're going to be
As God.
as God.
Knowing.
Holy. Okay. She was tempted. As a result, she fell into disobedience as a result of really not being informed or being misinformed of who she was. Notice what he said. In the day that you should eat thereof, you shall be as
God.
As something that you already were. She thought she was missing something that she already had. Y'all don't see that? Y'all don't see that? Y'all do know, we read a few verses ago, that here was an individual, notice, here was an individual who is created in the image and in the likeness of God. She was already everything that she needed to be. But thought that she was missing something that she already had. Not fully being informed of who she really was. The devil was able to actually get her to perceive herself as being something less than what she already was. And why is that important? The reason that that's important, when we talk about really defining what singleness is all about, singleness is really coming to a place to where one really understands who they are. And in understanding who they are, you're understanding that you're already complete and you're already whole, not lacking anything. Not to understand that is to fall into the same trap that Eve and then Adam did, is to go into a pursuit of trying to find something that you think you're missing to make you single or complete or whole. So we have to really come to a point to where we really understand that the whole idea of singleness is all of our should be all of our pursuit. So we began laying out at the beginning of our journey, these are some of the principles that we don't want to forget when it comes to what it means to be single. Singleness is a state to be pursued and not avoided. Singleness is not being unmarried. We're going to talk about, again, what singleness is. Singleness is the most important state of human development. What do we mean by that? We mentioned that God, when in his design of mankind and humanity, he started with one individual person. Didn't start with a couple. He started with an individual. And in starting with an individual, our whole society is built upon the basis of how psychologically adjusted the individual is. Every relationship foundationally begins with the individual. We also talked about God began the human family with one person and not a couple. He started with Adam. And Adam was complete. He was whole. He knew exactly who he was. He functioned in a way where there was nothing lacking or missing in him. Matter of fact, when it came to his interpersonal relationship, he was so much involved with his purpose that he did not even realize that it was necessary. Now, he did not realize that it was necessary to have an interpersonal relationship. Now, because he had come to a point to where he has settled in his intrapersonal relationship. His intrapersonal relationship had to do with the way that he viewed himself and the way he viewed his relationship that he had with God. In doing that, he was totally fulfilled. And then it was God who said, it's not good for him to be alone. Now, so for clarification, what does it mean to be single? Singleness means I don't need you to approve of me. When you're in a state of singleness, you're at a place to where you don't need somebody else interpersonally to validate who you are as a person. It means I don't need you to make me feel important. A sign that you are not actually single is when you are still in need of being validated by somebody else to make you feel important. It means I don't need you to tell me how good I am, because you already know the quality of how good you are. In other words, singleness, there are three aspects of singleness that I want to consider. Singleness is, and the author talks about this, he talks about singleness being separate, and singleness being unique, and singleness being the idea of being whole. Singleness, three aspects of singleness. Singleness, one is being separate, singleness being unique, and singleness meaning that you are whole. Okay, let's take this idea of being separate. What does the idea of separate mean? Separate means that you come to a place where you have become detached, different from everybody else. Separate. When you know you're single, you have become separate. You can see this. Let me give you an illustration. That means you're detached. You are okay with the fact that you are different from everybody else. This is important, especially when you grow up in a family and you got siblings. You know, because one of the struggles with growing up in a family system and you got brothers and sisters is this idea of really becoming single. And one of the characteristics is when you're able to be separate. When I can look at my brother or sister and not compare myself with who they are and being totally comfortable with who I am, I become detached in that sense. I got my grandkids reading a book right now, and I recommend this book to y'all. How many of us have read the book Jonathan Livingston Seagull? Anybody read that book? Sister Emery? Many years ago. Did you find it an interesting book? Okay. The interesting thing, everybody needs to read that book. I mean, it's a little fable. It's not very long. But here, the book is basically about Jonathan Livingston Seagull is a seagull who grows up and becomes single. He becomes single. Realizing that when he looked at himself and he looked at, even though he was a seagull, he saw himself as a unique individual and was willing to actually explore and live life as a unique single individual, not like the status quo of all the other seagulls. And he began to love himself. And one of the things that he wanted to do that the other seagulls didn't want to do, he didn't want to live a life relegated to like all other seagulls live. You know how seagulls live? Seagulls, they wait in terms of, they're relegated to a life to where they got to wait and try to find, they got to compete, you know, for their meals every day. They catch a fish underwater and you got to hit it just right. Or they wait to the bystanders leave some scraps of food on the beaches for them, and they have to kind of scavenge. And they're limited in what they can do in terms of flying and that kind of thing. But Jonathan Livingston Seagull decided, he began to question all of those norms. Being separate is when you get to a point to where you realize that you are detached, different from everybody else. It means I'm not my brother. I'm not my sister. I'm different from my friends. I'm not my friends. I'm my own person. That's what it means to be separate. And then you push back on the idea when somebody tried to actually impose their view of what you should be on you. People try to make you over. You know, y'all ever had anybody try to suggest that you should be this way? And in your heart of hearts, you know that that's really just not you. Then we go, singleness is not only being separate, it's also being unique. Unique, being different, is that I realize that I am one of a kind. And when we talk about fulfilling God's purpose, it's the realization that I realize that there is no person like me living now, living before now, or shall ever live after me. There's never been a person like me. Never will be a person like me. Never has been a person like me. I'm that unique. And God created me in such a way to where it's because of that uniqueness that brings me value.
Yes, sir.
That's where I get my value from. And then the idea of wholeness is when I become one with myself. The importance of being one is I realize that I don't need anything from some other person to complete me. I don't need somebody else to fulfill me. And I mentioned to us, especially, why is this concept really important for us to get and make it the point of our pursuing this type of idea of singleness in our lives? Because it will affect every relationship that we have, especially for those, being when we're talking about marriage. Let me mention something. Marriages, when we look at the divorce rate especially among Christians, you got to ask yourself, what is the cause of divorce in marriage? Divorce is a symptom. It's not the problem. It's the symptom. And y'all know what the symptom is? People not being single who decide to get married. And it's the misconception that, not knowing that I'm not single, it's the misconception that thinking that if I get married, I'm going to be whole. And I illustrated a couple of weeks ago, and see, this illustration actually applies not only to marriage, but it also applies to all other relationships too. And what marriage will do, if two people get married, or one person is single, the other person is not single, what happens is marriage will actually expose whether or not you are not single. Did y'all hear what I just said? Marriage is going to expose. If two people who are not single decide to get married, what the marriage relationship will do is going to expose them. Because here's what happens. You know, we even use the terminology, you know, when it comes to married couples, that, like, Sister Jackson is my better half, and I'm her better half, which is to suggest that I am incomplete without her, and she is incomplete without me. And so what happens is we go into this relationship thinking that the other is there to complete the other. And what happens is, with that happening, we begin to place demands on each other. Okay? She's my better half. All right? So here I am. And so what I needed to do is have a whole glass of water here. But we both halves. This is the point I'm making, right? And by both being halves, what I expect for her is to complete me, and in completing me, what happens is I do that. And what does that leave me? That's going to leave me empty after completing her. And that'll work for a minute. And then I'm going to start reacting to her because I done gave all of me to her in order to make her feel good about who she is. And so what happens then is she begins to have to give back to me. And what does that do to her? And people spend 10 years, 30 years, 40 years going back and forth because neither one of them have pursued becoming single and complete within themselves. And when two people are single, that means they're both full. And they enter a marriage not looking for what they can, not looking to get from the other, but they're coming from a position of actually giving what they have to give. And they're giving from an overflow, not from a lack thereof. Yeah. What happens is when two people enter a marriage and they are not single, they become parasites. they enter a relationship where both begin to suck and bleed the other for what they need, and they lack. Now that sounds like that's tough, right? But this doesn't, and again, this doesn't just apply to marriage. It also applies to other contexts too. You see it in dating relationships. Two people who are not single, they think that dating will be the answer to completing who they are. All right? They go into a dating relationship not being completed, or if it's two individuals who are not single, you have the same dynamic that we just described here with the water. But both are parasites. They come into the relationship actually sucking and bleeding the other for what they lack. How many of us know of a situation where you saw an individual who's unmarried? They were doing fine in careers. They were doing fine in serving in the kingdom of God. They were actually happy. Okay? And then, all of a sudden, they enter a relationship. Either dating or marriage. And then, at the point of that, because the individuals were not single, now their lives relationally start spinning in chaos. Y'all don't know nobody like that? Y'all don't know of any experiences like that? That's how important this really is. So I'm hoping that when we leave this subject, that you won't leave this without understanding whether you're married or unmarried. And by the way, we made the point, the pursuit of singleness doesn't stop when you get married. It's a lifelong pursuit. And the reason that that's important is marriage, when you look at it in God's original design, don't you notice that remember Jesus was asked a question about marriage, would there be marriage? The man came to Jesus and asking him about, he's been married several times, which one would be his wife after they die? And Jesus responded that, in heaven there is no marriage or given in marriage. So marriage is a temporary thing anyway, relegated to now. That's why it becomes even more difficult. Marriage is not permanent. So therefore, when a person passes, person goes back into a state of not being unmarried. To the degree that that individual is single, to that degree, it's going to be determined how well that person does after the passing of the loved one. I was hesitant to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, because I wanted to be the context. Mother Emery is a great example. No, she really is. Yes. How long were you married? No, 68 years. 68 years. Now, if I was to ask her how trying it's been after 68 years losing a spouse, a loved one of 68 years, I know it's very difficult. But the greater question is that, look at the quality of her life after. Not that it's been easy, but the interpersonal relationship that we're talking about at the beginning, it is now actually flourishing. You can see it's that actually sustains you. I don't want Sister Jackson to have to live in such a way to where she can't live without me. Amen. Now that sounds kind of crazy. No. But no. If so, we've missed the point.
Yes, sir.
Her fulfillment has to come from, first and foremost, from her relationship that she has with God. I'm hoping she, if something did happen, the only thing that would happen and separate is that, one of us pass on. So I'm hoping that she would miss me a little bit. But, I mean, not being able to go on. If she can't go on without me, it's just something went amiss. Y'all get the point?
Yeah.
So, with that being said, we're gonna leave the notion of singleness, and I'm gonna encourage everybody. We need to read the next chapter, which is the chapter of the context of your career, and then we're going to be expediting ourselves as we go into a series of exercises that will have to do with developing a purpose statement as we go into the year 2020. Amen.